to school where it was very, like you said, in my high school, I felt like so great. Our principal was black. You would have no problems. It was more just typical, like, I don't know, we didn't have to have a safe space because the school was a safe space as it could be in high school. But so then I will never forget, I had so many experiences that I won't share right now because we don't have time. But, you know, the question is, I remember there was a classmate of mine who was very mean to me for the 4 years, basically saying I was just angry for no reason kind of thing. And then, you know, 2 years after we graduated, actually wrote me on Facebook to apologize and said she had been going to some of the Black Lives Matter meeting, and she really started to understand why I was so angry and that she is so apologetic. And I'm reading this book called with my students in the Time of Butterflies about the Maribel sisters in the Dominican Republic who were fighting against Trujillo. And one of the sisters says, I didn't have enough courage to go with her other 3 sisters to fight against the dictator. And sometimes I feel that it takes a lot of courage to go in those institutions, and everyone has different courage. But it's just so difficult. Like, you want agency, but I just need advice because sometimes I feel I cannot take, you know, some of the experiences.
Yeah, and thank you for those reflections. I mean, my purpose today was to sort of paint a picture of some of the things I experienced, but in no way, shape, or form do they represent the sum or the totality of my experiences at these institutions of higher learning. That would be dishonest. So if I could go back and do it again, I would. There were some painful moments, to be sure. But especially for this identity and this background that I'm talking about, education has really been the most single transformative force in my life as a person. Being able to start NYU so young, 16 years old, there's no other experience like that. Opening up your mind and taking you to new heights, letting you find out things that you just literally never knew before and that I would have never, there's no other way that I would have been able to have access to that type of information, being able to have those encounters, and just really exposing you to something far bigger and far larger than you. And the diversity of thought, the diversity of opinion, which time will not permit, but which is why I had just shared parenthetically that here you have people who sometimes are going to missionary school or divinity school, you know, to become a pastor, or to become a Buddhist monk, or whatever the case may be, to become a nun, and then by the time they finish the program, they decide that they don't want to do that. And we have a bunch of stories of people who have gone through a situation like that. And why is that? Because they were being engaged by the information that they were learning. And that's what information does. Sometimes it takes you to a place that you didn't realize you were going. And sometimes you think you're going in so that you can become an art history major, and by the time you're done, you're like, thank God I was here, because I definitely don't want to do art history. So that's why we should always, you know, seize the opportunity if it's available to us. So that's my opinion. Some people here may disagree, but I'm a big proponent.
Thank you so much. So if you have any closing words, we can close in. I think we have like 5 minutes or 4.
A minute. Your last actual word. I'm not agnostic. I'm not an atheist. But one thing I do believe in, the total is equal to the sum of all the parts. And God gave us all choice, didn't he? Do you know the man in ACT? Because I have that. I want to send it to you later. The man who started the program called ACT UP. I'm watching television, and he said, he did just like this. God, I don't believe in you, but thank you for letting me live. Oops. That's on YouTube. I took a cross that I happen to be Ethiopian Orthodox, to Maryland and showed it to the owner of the restaurant. He's Greek. He ran home and brought his mother so she can get a blessing, and she looked at me, she says, I didn't know they were black Orthodox. Like you said, it's part of your expression there. But the main part is the total is equal to the sum of all the parts. When you were talking about Ray Ron, and how people different think, it takes all kinds. The total is equal to the sum of all the parts.
Thank you. Well, let's please give Dr. Oh, I lost the page. Dr. Frontus, another round of applause, please.
So we have a few minutes before we start the next panel, so we'll start in about 3 minutes or so. we're going to go ahead and get started. So our next guest speaker is Dr. Albert Mosley. He is in the Department of Philosophy at Smith College, and he is going to be presenting a paper entitled Religion in 18th and 19th Century Religion in 18th and 19th Century Intellectuals of African Ancestry. So please welcome Dr. Mosley.
Thank you. Actually, the title should be Race in 18th and 19th Century Discourse by Africans in the Diaspora. It's the concept of race that I have researched on this. Now, this is the first time I've presented this. In the longer version, I look at Africans in Europe, and I look at Africans in England, and I explore their conceptions of race. Wilhelm Amo was, I will just give you a little background. Quite often when slavers traveling through the Gold Coast would pick out very likely, very intelligent, very amiable young men and make them their cabin boys. And often they would take them back to Europe and make them gifts to the aristocracy. And these Africans would be treated like pets. You know, so everywhere the kids go, the pet goes. And every lesson that the kids get, the pet gets. You know how the dog is in the house, you know, they's right there. And so a number of Africans became extremely well educated as a result. One was Wilhelm Amo. He was taken from what is now Ghana to Germany. He got a doctorate degree in philosophy, and he was also trained in all of the classical languages, that is Greek, Hebrew, Latin, as well as French, German, and English. William Amo. There is another one, Jacobus Kapitein, who was also got a PhD in the Netherlands. Okay, and then he went back to Ghana and was the pastor at Elmina Castle, which at one time had been occupied by the Dutch. But I won't go into them. The others in England, Ignacio Sancho, who was again educated in the family of aristocracy, and he was well known in London for his culture and his, especially what's called belles lettres. It used to be that people wrote letters a lot. We don't do that anymore. We write emails and tweets, you know. But it was an art form, writing letters, especially when you incorporate current affairs. So Ignacio Sanchez was also a musician, and a number of his compositions were performed in London. You can actually go on the internet and find some renditions of his music. But Ignacio Sanchez was from 1729 until 1782. His memoirs were published after then. Another one is, I'm sure many of you have heard of, Oludwa Ikweano. Okay, he again was captured by Africans in what is now eastern Nigeria and brought to the West Indies, and from the West Indies to Virginia. He became the cabin boy to a naval officer, and he learned navigation, reading, writing. You know, he became very good seaman. Okay, afterwards he was able to buy his freedom, and he went to London as well. and the last one, Kwabena Kuguano. I think perhaps the most interesting of them because he wrote a treatise on race. Let me see, what is that? Oh my gosh. I know, sir. Things are not in order. But he wrote a treatise on race, and it is one that I use a great deal in the paper. Here. Cuguano, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery. That is the name of his books. Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery. Now, what we will find is that for most of these, the evil comes in associating race, one's race with slavery. Okay. And most of the Africans in particular were not so much against slavery as they were against African slavery, because prior to the 16th century, slavery was an equal opportunity category. Anybody could be kidnapped and thrown on a boat, and you wake up and you're out in the middle of the ocean. It didn't matter whether you were white or black or red or green or male or female. Okay, this is how slaves were traded. Barnaby trade slave, I'm sure many of you have heard of that, you know. Russia, let us see here. But I'm going to skip all of the Africans, and I'm going to start with David Walker. That is, I'm going to discuss Africans in the United States who discuss the concept of race. He was 1796 to 1830. Okay, only 34 years old. People didn't live long in the old days, only 34 years old. Okay, but David Walker wrote Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, to those of the United States especially, written in Boston, September 28, 1829. He affiliated with the AME Church, and he issued a call for black Americans to rise up and oppose the oppression of slavery and racism. So in a sense, he condemned slavery. As I said, the Africans did not condemn slavery. They felt that if there are people who transgress the rights of others, then those people should be restrained. And of course, that is the basis for contemporary enslavement. You see, is that if you are convicted by a court, you lose your freedom, you lose your rights, you become a slave. Okay, but Walker opposed slavery and race. He referred to whites as the natural enemies of blacks, and he explains this by reference to the biblical account of the genesis of races. After the flood, Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, were the only men on earth and were the progenitors of the current races. But Walker denies that contemporary Africans are the descendants of Canaan, the cursed son of Ham. Nowhere in the Bible, Walker asserts, are the descendants of Canaan identified as being of a black complexion. Whites who are serious students of the Bible know this, he asserted, but they distort the text to make it seem as if Africans were cursed by God. In order to continue their exploitation, these whites refuse to acknowledge the lie upon which slavery is justified. They fear that if their hypocrisy is exposed, blacks will seek vengeance and reparations. Those who engage in this kind of distortion make themselves into the natural enemies of those they are oppressing. Blacks who continue to serve whites as if it were their duty are equally oppressors. Okay. Walker admonished former slaves to throw off their slave habits. So I do this bit on Walker. The next I look at is Martin Delaney, 1812 to 1885. Born in West Virginia, again born a free person, and he was accepted at Harvard Medical School, but the students opposed his being there. He did study under abolitionist doctrines, and he was one of the first black nationalists advocating that African Americans should return to Africa. Delaney gives the following explanation of the origin of races. Before the flood, he writes, all people were a dark, rouge complexion. However, after the flood, the three sons of Noah, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, developed different complexions. Delaney assures us that Shem was the dark rouge of Noah, Japheth was light complexion, and Ham was dark complexions. These are facts generally conceded, he offers. It is presumed that Shem migrated to Asia, Japheth to Europe, and Ham to Africa. They were not separate creations of God, but became separate and different after God's creation due to environmental influences on the skin. The next one I cover is Alexander Crummell, 1819 to 1898. He was born again, free parents in New York City. He was ordained as an Episcopal priest, studied at Queen's College, Cambridge, and as Cambridge's first black graduate. He believed that only after Africans united they'd be able to succeed, and in 1853 he moved to Liberia to bring civilization and Christianity to Africa. But he returned to the U.S. in 1873, fleeing the Liberian aristocracy, the Liberian mulatto aristocracy, which he, Blyden, and many others reacted to. In 1897, he founded the American Negro Academy. Crummell accepted the biblical account of human creation, in which all races were formed after the flood from the various sons of Noah. Crummell also accepted that Shem and his family migrated to Asia, Japheth to Europe, and Ham to Africa. In the most common telling of the Genesis story, Noah becomes drunk and is observed naked by Ham. Noah then curses Ham, declaring that his son Canaan would be servants of servants. Since Ham is the one guilty of the offense against Noah, many have been inclined to believe that the curse was against Ham, but Crummell shows carefully that the curse was not against Ham, but against Canaan. Ham had 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. Canaan was youngest and Cush the oldest. But Noah is explicit in making the curse on Canaan and does not extend that curse to Cush, Mizraim, or Phut. Cush, the eldest, is viewed by Crummell as the progenitor of the African race, including Egypt and Ethiopia. The Canaanites did not enter Africa, Crummell argues, but instead spread to Judea, Phoenicia, and then into Europe. He concludes, quote, the blood of the Canaanites was more mingled with that of Europeans than with Africans, for they formed more colonies in Europe than in Africa, and their influence was stronger in Europe than in Africa, end of quote. The descendants of Canaan in Palestine, Phoenicia, Carthage were not black, Crummell asserts. They were not Negroes in lineage or colors. Okay. Shut in by desert to the north and oceans to the east, the descendants of Cush were isolated from Europe and Asia into the 15th century. The slave trade brought Africa and the progeny of Cush into dynamic relationship with Europe and the progeny of Japhet. But it was not the progeny of Cush that was cursed by Noah. Kummel does not seek an ultimate explanation of why the descendants of Cush have been enslaved. Instead, he points out that many races have been enslaved, not just Africans. Jews were enslaved by the Ethiopians, the Irish were enslaved by the English, and the Saxons as well. Okay, they were bought and sold like horses. Slavery has existed within many diverse races, but modern African slavery, he argues, is a totally different type than traditional slavery. In ancient times, slaves sometimes rose to positions of great prominence, but in modern slavery, this possibility was denied for Africans. Modern slavery not only denied Africans their freedom, it denied their potential for freedom. Krumah explicitly proposes to show that that the Negro was not enslaved because his race had been cursed by God, because the descendants of Cush were not cursed by God, and that a black complexion was not a mark of God's curse, since a black complexion. No mention is made of Cush being cursed. For Krumah, a race is an extended family created by God and endowed with an affinity for others of that race. Because of this affinity, members of a race tend to perpetuate certain characteristic features. They are attracted to others like themselves. Okay? So a sort of natural synergy. The contemporary mixture between blacks and whites has not been the result of mutual attractions, however, but the result of the rape of black women by white men. This Krumah speculates disadvantages the mixed race progeny of such unions. So this is one source of this idea that mulattoes have something wrong with them, that somehow or other things are not coordinated. Edward Blyden is the next person I will introduce. Born in the Danish West Indies, he was encouraged to go to theological school by a Dutch Reformed minister who found him in the Virgin Islands, but he was refused entrance, and John Knox, the minister, encouraged him to go to Liberia, which he did. He became a professor of Greek, Latin, and West African languages at Liberia College, and served as its president from 1880 to 84. He was an advocate of Africans returning to Africa to develop Africa's special gifts and aptitudes. Because the Negro is distinctive in complexion, hair, nose, and lips, and because the Negro is a servant of all the other races, Biden acknowledges how easy it is to assume that there is a causal relationship between these two things. The complexion causes you to be a slave, because it is a mark. The most common explanation was that the Negro's complexion was a mark of God's curse through Noah on the children of Ham. And even though the curse clearly designates Canaan in Genesis, it is interpreted as to apply to all the descendants of Ham. This made it possible to extend the curse to all African people and provided a convenient justification for African slavery, no matter where in Africa. Defenders of slavery contended that it was fruitless to endeavor to elevate the African, for he was doomed to perpetual servitude and was therefore fitted for no other condition except as a slave. In this way, many devout Christians absolve themselves of the wrongful treatment of Africans, reasoning that since Africans had already been cursed by God, those who profited from slavery were simply fulfilling God's curse. Bryden emphasized how even though the curse was explicitly against Canaan, it was convenient for slave owners to interpret it as if the curse were against Ham and all his descendants. Some students of the Bible were bothered. I will skip this part. Well, I will read it. Some students of the Bible were bothered that Canaan was forced to bear the punishment when Ham was the transgressor. Ham looked at his father naked. But Blyden gives many examples of God's curse being against both the transgressor and the transgressor's descendants. You know, I'm going to curse you and your mama too. Okay. Slavery was the instrument that God used to punish the Canaanites. The Israelites, having been slaves to the Egyptians, now made the Canaanites their slaves. The Canaanites became servants of servants. But Blyden reiterates it was not the intention of the malediction that either Mizraim or Cush, whose descendants peopled Africa, should be servants of servants, but it did intend that the descendants of Canaan should be servants of servants. For Blyden, African slavery was the effect of sin, not Noah's curse. He explains that Africans had knowledge of the true God in the past, but they had lost it and descended into heathenism. Slavery was Africa's punishment for the sin of abandoning God. And as Africans accepted the true God of Christianity, they would cease to be slaves. It is the blessings promised by redemption in Christianity that made the afflictions of slavery bearable. Blyden directly confronts the belief that Africans are less intelligent than Europeans. He cites an array of African intellectuals, artists, and poets to prove that Africans were just as capable of European achievements as were Europeans. Okay. Arguments in our favor, he said, that would be regarded as conclusive in regard to any other race are unceremoniously discarded. Instead, the most unfavorable isolated cases are taken as fair specimens of the character of the true race. So when whites want to put blacks down, they point out those who are least educated, you know, who have the worst character possible. His argument that only when Africans are given the same opportunities as Europeans will it be possible to say if one or the other is superior or not. Until equal conditions prevail, it is impossible to say that Africans have less or more potential than Europeans. Biden concludes, give Africans the same amount of culture from generation to generation that Europeans have enjoyed, and their features and thoughts will assume the same proportion and symmetry. Blyden believed that Africa could not exceed unless the slave trade was abolished and talented Africans, educated under slavery, returned to Africa to lead and teach. Africans could not depend on having Europeans as their primary teachers because Europeans in Africa typically suffered disease and discomfort and projected their infirmities onto their view of African people. Africans from America would adapt better to African conditions than Europeans and would not be so ill-fitted to their tasks. He writes, only the Negro will be able to explain the Negro to the rest of mankind. He considered those sold into slavery to have been of the lower classes of Africa, convicted criminals, prisoners of war, etc., yet they are conflated with African noblemen and scholars. Biden emphasized there are many races in Africans. Fulanese, Mandingos, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, no short definition is enough to include all of these. He also denied that, am I going over by the way? Okay. He also denied that the Negro is the European in embryo, still undeveloped. Many people argue that. Rather, he declares that Africans have a distinct role to play in the advance of civilization, and this role is specific to the race. Africans and Europeans are not identical, but unequal. They are distinct, but equal. End quote. The African has capacities and attitudes, he writes, which the world needs, but which he will never enjoy until the African is fairly and normally trained. When the African shall come forth with his peculiar gifts, he will fill a place never before occupied. Because of this, Blyden opposed racial amalgamation. Let us do away with the sentiment of race, he writes. Let us do away with our African personality and be lost, if possible, in another race. This is as wise and as philosophical as to say, let us do away with gravitation, with heat and cold, with sunshine and rain. Of course, the race in which these persons would be absorbed is the dominant race, before which in cringing self-surrender and ignoble self-suppression they lie in prostrate admiration. End quote. So Blyden and Cromwell were both ardent black nationalists and argued very strongly that African Americans should return to Africa. Frederick Douglass was 1818, he's the last person I cover here. 1818 to 1895, was born as Frederick Bailey, a slave in Maryland. Okay, after the famous fight with his overseer Covey, he escaped from slavery and changed his name to Douglass. During the early years working as an abolitionist, he was a fugitive slave and had to avoid being arrested by bounty hunters. In 1838, he married a free black woman, Anna Murray. He became licensed to preach. He worked with William Garrison, the abolitionist Liberator, until he formed his own paper, the North Star newspaper. And the motto of the North Star was, right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. He traveled to Ireland in 1845 at the beginning of the potato famine and remained in Europe for 2 years. During this time, British abolitionists raised enough money to buy his freedom from his former owner. At 28 years old, he was no longer a fugitive. For Douglass, the problem was not in color, sex, religion, or ancestral origin. The problem was when such factors were used to justify oppressing others. Thus, Douglass was as much opposed to the Asian cheap labor or coolie trade as he was opposed to the African slave trade. After the abolishment of slavery, people from India and Asia were hired and transported to plantations in Asia and the West Indies to do the work Africans could no longer be forced to do. As coolies, these workers were viewed not as human beings, but as sources of cheap labor and forced to work much as Africans had been under slavery. Thus, Douglass wrote, the rights of a coolie in California, in Peru, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, and on board the vessels bearing them to these countries are scarcely more than those of Negro slaves brought to our shores a century ago. The suffering of these people while in transit are almost as heartrending as any that attended the African slave trade. End quote. In 1871, the ship Dolores Ugarte sank, carrying over 500 Asian laborers to work on plantations in Asia and America. They were locked below deck, and when the ship caught fire, they were burned to death. This far exceeds the number of the 132 Africans that were thrown overboard from the slave ship Zone in 1783. They were thrown overboard to collect insurance as you would throw a cow or a hog or a horse. Douglas writes, "My sentiments originate not in my color, but in a sense of justice common to all right-minded men. It is not because I am a Negro, but because I am a man. It is that which gives the sympathy of the crowd to the underdog, no matter what may be his color," end quote. He also believed that the sense of justice common to all right-minded men should apply to all right-minded women, and Douglas was an early supporter of women's rights. Throughout his life, Douglas actively opposed the oppression of humans on the basis of race, sex, religion, and ethnic origin. How is my time?
We have 15 minutes left for your
Okay, then this is a conclusion. Prominent Anglo-American intellectuals of African descent during the 18th and 19th century used European religion, European science, and European philosophy to argue that Africans were not cursed by God, were not an inherently inferior people, and were not a race of natural slaves. That notion, comes from Aristotle. They accepted Christianity as the source of revealed truth and accepted the biblical account of the sons of Noah, Shem, Japheth, and Ham as the progenitors of the present races. But they make clear that Noah's curse on Canaan has invalidly been taken to be a curse on all the children of Ham. The curse was on Canaan and his descendants, and Africans were descendants of Cush, not Canaan. Intellectuals of African descent also accepted the importance of logic and scientific reasoning. They critically engaged scientific accounts and offered alternatives that gave Africans a potential equal to that of Europeans. 19th century African American intellectuals in the U.S. emphasized a new concern not just with the past origin of races, but with the future evolution of races. Should the races be separate and distinct, or should they amalgamate and become mixed? Questions about race and mixed race continue to bedevil the modern world. Thank you very much.
All right, are there any questions for Dr. Mosley? Not from the audience? Okay, well, okay. If not, I have a few, so please go ahead.
So maybe it's more of a statement. In the intellectuals that you spoke of, not one is an African woman, a woman of African descent. And we know why, but I think even in this space, how do we as women also create intellectual histories beyond our art of food, domestic work, right? In an intellectual space, when so much of our history is not recorded and has been erased.
Well, I think that the reason is because women were considered unequal even by most African men, if not more than European men. It was a very radical new movement with John Stuart Mill, in the 19th century, and the women's suffrage movement, But in general, like Phyllis Wheatley, of course, is one great example, and there are others, but most of the published work has been on men.
Enjoyed your paper again, sir. I didn't recognize you until you walked up here. You lost weight. See, I remember when. Your paper, when you mentioned the history, I went to a conference at Fordham University this March. Matter of fact, I delivered a paper there. And the title was Emancipation, Philosophy at the Intersection of American and European Philosophy. And my paper was one big question. My mother always said, demand your senior citizen rights. Who is the senior citizen on this planet? It sure isn't Africa or Europe. Am I correct or not? Thank you, Doc.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I have a question. So I wish you would have been able to get into the discussion on, is it AMO? Because I was actually interested in hearing about how they conceptualize race coming from the continent of Africa and going to Europe. You said England specifically. So how did they specifically conceptualize race in that space where they are now, you know, in an environment where they don't see people that look like them all the time? You know, they're coming from one space to another where there's some, you know, drastic differences on the populations and things like that. So I know you said that with Delaney, Cramell, and Blyden, that they were able to understand race through, or they used European religions to show evidence of equality. So I don't know if the African, the individuals you mentioned coming directly from Africa, Equiano included in that, how they considered or conceptualized race differently than their African American counterparts.
I think one of the things they tried not to do is think about race differently. They wanted to use the concepts that Europeans accepted to show that the Europeans were drawing the wrong conclusions. You see, so most of them accepted that they were that they were benefited by being introduced to literacy, for instance. You know, literacy, so you can read back 1,000 years, 2,000 years. You see, in Africa, you can't do that. So they thought this was a great tool, and Christianity as well. So for them, Amo argued, for instance, that the Moors had been recognized by Justinian, and therefore that the enslavement of Africans was unacceptable in Europe. In Germany and the Netherlands, they were early to reject enslavement. You know. But I think that most of these, and then the ones in England, you know, they were using the master's tool in order to oppose the master.
Okay, as a form of resistance. In a sense.
Yes, that would, because those were the only tools they had.
While he's on his way up here to make a question, well, actually, I'll let you go ahead, and if we have time, I'll ask my second question.
Dr. Mosley, thank you very much. I got a book of yours when you come down, I want you to sign it, right? It's kind of a side question because I see with respect you're doing here, you're doing like a, in some sense, not necessarily historical anthropology, but just talking about the 18th and 19th people of African descent, their ideas as it's related to race.
Yes.
I got a couple of things that came to mind, but I just want to ask you one, if you don't mind, and is related to Amo, Wilhelm Amo. I'm not sure if you're familiar, well, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of his work. I'm not sure if you'll be able to give me a definitive answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you. I know that he had a critique of...
Who is this you're speaking of?
Wilhelm Amo.
Oh, yes, Wilhelm Amo.
Right, so I know he had a critique of Cartesian dualism.
Yes.
What's your ideas on that?
Well, you know, for you, Cartesian dualism is the idea that there is a radical difference between mind and body. Okay, that's Cartesian dualism. And monism is that there is no such distinction. Now, for Amo, he wanted to argue again that the distinction was bogus. And so he tried to show, in his arguments about emotions and ideas, how these things are intermingled. Okay, but that's about as far as.
Okay, all right. Okay.
But it's definitely something that, again, is something that we should be following through. And I have never seen a copy of his thesis.
Okay.
I don't even know if your library or mine has a copy of his thesis.
Right, I've actually was told by somebody else in the past too that nobody can find it.
Yeah.
Nobody can actually find it, right? So, but that's something I'm interested in because in some sense of my work, I'm addressing that same issue.
Yes,
Okay, all right, thank you.
that's right. You know, they have a thing now in philosophy called embodied cognition.
Right, right.
Yeah, you see what I mean? So that's a really radical move away from Cartesian dualism.
That's it, yep.
All right, I have one more question specifically about Alexander Crummell. So I don't know if you're familiar with the book called Un-African Africans, and it's specifically about 18th and 19th century African Americans going back to Africa as a form of colonization in a sense. But the idea behind the terminology un-African Africans is that they were going back to colonize parts of Africa because the Africans were considered heathen or non-religious or, following false gods. So how do you reconcile that notion of viewing Africans as less than with this idea of black nationalism? Because my idea of black nationalism stems from some sort of wanting to build a better relationship and also grounded on a sense of equality. But it seems like Crummell's going to Africa with the sense that the people he's going to, try to convert to Christianity are less than in some sense.
Well, Blyden was very respectful of the Africans. He made a clear distinction between ignorance and stupidity. The African may have been ignorant of a lot of things, but that doesn't mean they were stupid. So the point is to go back and bring them the knowledge that they need in order to address modernity. You see, so early Africans tried to get many of their people to come to Europe so they could study European languages and European science. This is one way that they could then learn how to make guns instead of having to buy them from the Europeans. They can make cannons without buying them from the Europeans. Africans already had metallurgy, so they were, quite competent, but the Europeans were quite careful not to give them too much. So religion and philosophy were often the easier routes for Africans in Europe and America. But again, I believe they used those tools for their own liberation and for the liberation of other Africans. They didn't deny that Africans were illiterate, and I think that's something that when you see someone who's illiterate, then they are illiterate. They can't read, so they are not capable of taking advantage of so much. Does that mean that I'm better than that person? Well, I'm a better reader, but there are many places where that person may be far exceed my abilities as well, and so this is what Blyden saw.
All right, we have time for one more statement.
Follow-up is a book called Your History by J.A. Rogers. I know you know that book. You remember what's on page 71? In 1745, a man who could not read or write, an African, was able to complete a math test, and he beat a white educated man by 90 seconds who used a pencil, and he used his brain. So the Africans were not stupid.
And the other thing, of course, is to remember Islam had been in Africa long before Christianity. There were many Africans who had memorized the entire Quran, and some of them were used in order to translate the Quran into English.
So I was chastised a bit when I went back to my seat, for good reason, because I was told I was too nice to you when I brought my comment about women. And I think in future iterations of this talk, I think it's important that Phyllis Wheatley and Anna Julia Cooper and others are also included in, because even if the writing is not, we don't have the same depth and breadth, I think it's not okay, especially in 2015, to continue that misogyny in our circles.
I agree with you totally.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Mosley, for your intriguing paper, and please, everyone, give our speaker a hand of thank you.
You know, I need a little help. I dropped my pen. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Mosley. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Seastrom, and I'm here to introduce Rich Jeffrey B. Perry. He is considered to be an independent scholar of the working class. He's formerly educated at Princeton, Harvard, Rutgers, and Columbia. He's also the editor of the Hubert Harrison Reader. Welcome. While he's working on that, I can share a few comments with you. I thought he was ready to go here. Cornel West said of this book that Jeffrey wrote about Hubert Harrison, who he's going to talk to us about, he said, nope.
We're ready to start, because I want to do a lot of slides with you all today. I'll go fast. Some of the slides have a lot of words. I'll try to just highlight the key points. Some have pictures. I hope you'll appreciate this. We're going to speak about Hubert Harrison, who lives from 1883 to 1927. He was born in St. Croix, Virgin Islands, in the Spanish West Indies at the time. He arrives in New York City here in 1900. Everyone can hear me, correct? This is better. Okay. Let me see if this works. I don't want to play with this. I'll just swing it this way, if that's all right. He's a brilliant writer, orator, educator, and critic and political activist, and one of the most extraordinary intellectual activists of the early 20th century, and I am quite convinced he is going to continue to grow in importance in the 21st century, and I'll give you some reasons why. Here's a picture of him. This is volume 1 of a 2-volume biography I'm doing on him. I've been working on him for 35 years. This is Columbia University Press. The book is 616 pages, 116 pages of notes, 60 photographs with detailed captions. If you read the back cover, what Julie was just starting with Cornel West and others, or the inside covers, or on the web page, you'll see many, many, many of the leading activists and scholars that you're familiar with commenting on how very important Hubert Harrison is. And I also want to point out, when this is completed, I've got about 1,600 pages on volume 2, first multi-volume biography of Afro-Caribbean, and only the 5th of an African American after those of Booker T, Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and Langston Hughes. Here's a book that has 138 of about 700 articles that he's written that we've identified. I have copies of all these here. I can show everyone later. And it's a Hubert Harrison Reader. It's Wesleyan University Press. Each article is introduced. And what's of particular relevance, I think, for this conference is in this book, I pull many of his, not many, because he's got many, but I pull a good selection of his articles on Africa and particularly on Africa in his international subjects, because he's wide-ranging in his intellectual perspective. Here's a book that's coming out, I think, later this month, which I did all the new introductions, the back matter, and really supplemented. It's Harrison's book. Look at the title, please. When Africa Awakes. He wrote this in 1920. The inside story of the stirrings and strivings of the new Negro in the Western world. When that was republished in 1997, they left out the subtitle on the book, and they left out his introduction. But in this book, there are 53 Harrison articles on the new Negro movement that he wrote between 1917 and 1920. This redoes all of that new Negro history, Alain Locke, 1925. As you'll see when you come to know Harrison, the new Negro movement starts almost a decade earlier in social and political activism, but it's also extraordinarily literary. And this book, as I said, is coming out at the end of the month. And if you look at the little flag up in the corner, we'll talk about that more later, but that's the flag of his organization, the Liberty League. It's black, brown, and yellow. Later on, Garvey joins Harrison's organization, but later on, Garvey switches to red, black, and green, which people are more familiar, but I'll get into this more later. Here's his papers. I was able to track down about 35 years ago now, track down his family, and they had preserved all his papers on a railroad flat up on 150th Street off Bradhurst since 1927, because they knew how important he was. And when at a certain point on my third visit, they said, come, take a look. And then they told me, take these and do what you need to do. So I became an archivist overnight. I preserved, archived, transcribed everything. When the family was ready, we talked to Schomburg, Center, Columbia, various places. The family decided on Columbia University. There's a 102-page finding aid. The papers are available to the public freely. If you want to go in, say you want to go see the Harrison papers, you get access upstairs. And the family got all the money. I'm quite independent. I'm not in this for the money, you know. And here's my webpage. If you go to this webpage, you'll find all kinds of audio and video material on Hubert Harrison, and also on the other person I write about, Theodore W. Allen, who is the author of the 2-volume classic, The Invention of the White Race. We came out with a new edition two and a half years ago for Verso Press. But Allen also started writing on white skin privilege back in 1965, but it's a class analysis, so it's qualitatively different from the knapsack stuff that people are familiar with nowadays if you go online. Okay, here we go on Harrison. 1883 to 27, brilliant intellectual, race and class conscious, and a self-described radical internationalist. Joel A. Rogers, who was mentioned earlier, in World's Great Men of Color, describes Hubert Harrison as perhaps the foremost Afro-American intellect of his time. Harrison as an intellectual, he comes to New York in 1900. In 1903, while he's still in high school, the New York World, one of the daily newspapers, runs a headline, "Genius Found in West Indian Pupil." He's working 5 days a week and a couple nights, barely going to high school, and he's getting citywide honors in several subjects, including oratory. They had never seen anybody like this. Harrison, self-educated. He's an autodidact. He spoke or read, to some degree, varying degrees, 6 languages, including in his last years he was teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran, not because he was a religious, but because it's a religion of so many people of African descent. He read voraciously. When he died, the obituaries in the Amsterdam News and elsewhere had various people commenting that it was said he read several books a day. Now, I know that sounds, overwhelming, but I've been through the books that remained in his collection, and you see he knew how to attack books aggressively and go after what he wanted in them. And as an orator, he was the pioneering soapbox orator in Harlem, but he also spoke, and I'm getting to this, he spoke down on Wall Street, he talked at Union Square, 40,000 people, he occupied Wall Street back in 1912, it's staggering, but he was so wide-ranging, history, science, politics, religion, education, literature, theater, evolution, race, class, Africa, the Caribbean, and on and on. as I said, he's 700 pieces he's written. As an editor, he was an editor of The Masses, which was the leading left literary publication of the first years of the decade between 1910 and 20. He is the editor of The Voice, a newspaper, listen to the subtitle, a newspaper for the New Negro, 1917. It's the first paper of the New Negro movement. He's also the founder of the Liberty League, the first organization of the New Negro movement that same year. He edits in 1919 The New Negro, a journal, The New Negro, intended as an organ of the international consciousness of the darker races and of the... This is 6 years before Alain Locke, right? He is the principal editor of the Negro World, that's Garvey's paper in 1920, and an associate editor until 1922. And his last organ, or his last newspaper that he's an editor of, is entitled The Voice of the Negro in 1927, which he's editing till shortly before his death. As a critic, he's an extraordinary book reviewer. If you jump down to the bottom, I don't know if I have any of these pointers working. I'll just tell you, down at the bottom, he is described as the first regular book critic in Negro newspaperdom. But I don't know that he's taught in a literature course in this country, right? But he writes, we've located 68 to 70 reviews. When Eugene O'Neill reads his review of The Emperor Jones, he says, this is as fine a piece as I've seen any place, any theater I have anything to do with, you have a role in. In 1907, when he's working the midnight shift in the post office, he has 2 front-page articles on literary criticism, New York Times Saturday review of books. Back then it was Saturday, now it's Sunday. And he writes about 13 pieces in the New York Times between 1903 and 1910. This quote from Hubert Harrison, you don't have to read the whole thing, but I want to point out, Harrison is a book reviewer. This quote was on the front page, going back, down at the bottom, of 2 of the executive members of the National Book Critics Circle. This is today, right? And Harrison, when he talks about reviewing books, he goes, in the first place, remember, the public wants to know whether it's worth their while to read the book. They're interested in the book, not you. Respect yourself, so keep your hates and everything to yourself for a little bit, right? Respect yourself and your office so that you will not complacently pass and praise drivel and rubbish. Give honest service, so will your opinion be... It's got a certain integrity he brings to his intellectual work, right? Continuing with Harrison as an intellectual. And this is what I'm talking about today is mostly from Volume 1. Volume 2, really, we'll get into what it's going to cover later on, but we won't be able to get into it today. But this is from Volume 1 up till 1918 of his biography. He's a pioneer black activist in the socialist movement, in the free thought movement, in the birth control movement, New Negro movement. He's a promoter and aide to black writers and artists, Augusta Savage, Charles Gilpin, U.B. Blake, Sol Platt, Claude McKay. The list goes on, because he works well with the artists. He understands the importance of art. He's a featured lecturer for the New York City Board of Education. He is a bibliophile, a lover of books, and a library popularizer. He is a founding officer of the committee that established the Committee on Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints, which is what grew into the Schomburg Center. He and Schomburg are 2 of the 5 founding officers. He would lecture every week, bringing people to the 135th Street Library, because he thought free public libraries were one of the great institutions in this country. Here he is teaching a course on world problems of race in 1926 on 125th Street. I wrote 68. I think that's how many. I counted. I might be wrong. But a couple of the people, Harrison speaking over here to this far side is Richard B. Moore, people may be familiar with, African Blood Brotherhood, Socialist Party, Communist Party, Frederick Douglass Bookstore in Harlem in his last years. Right in front with the book on it, sitting in the chair in the center, is W.A. Domingo. Over here, the second woman in, from the left-hand side in the first row, is Liliana Burrows, a New York City public school teacher, an outstanding activist. She also runs for office up in Harlem, and during World War II, she does English language radio show in the Soviet Union. And in the back is Hermie Weisswood, who's from, she's from Guyana, and she and her husband are active in the international communist movement for many years. And I'm looking for the old-timers to come and help me identify some more. But I go around sometimes and speak with Richard B. Moore's daughter, Joyce Moore, who's now 92. And she's written wonderful books, Caribbean Crusaders of the Harlem Renaissance and Richard B. Moore, Caribbean Militant in Harlem. She says, Jeff, please, when you show this picture, point out to your audience that these people are working people, and they would dress up at night. And she says during the day, many of them might be wearing service clothes or something like that. This is the intellectual, this is because Harrison's an educator from the bottom up. This is one of what I think is very appealing about him. That's overview of Harrison as an intellectual. Harrison is a radical. This is A. Philip Randolph, March on Washington. He calls, and he's not the only one, he calls Hubert Harrison the father of Harlem radicalism, right? Hubert Harrison played unique signal roles, leading roles in the largest class radical and the largest race radical movements of his era. He was the leading black organizer, agitator, and theoretician in the Socialist Party during its 1912 heyday. He's the founder of the first organization, first newspaper, the New Negro Movement, editor of the Negro World, the Garvey movement. Scholars like Robert A. Hill, who's one of the leading Garvey experts, is very clear that the Garvey movement is a component part of that New Negro movement. 1912, I mentioned this previously. This is from the New York Times. Hubert Harrison speaking on Wall Street. He goes out at 1 o'clock and starts speaking, this one he's with the socialists, and he starts speaking on socialists, and he goes on until the market closes at 4, as far as the voice could reach. That's how far the audience reached. So this is really an Occupy Wall Street of history that our current generation should know a bit more about. And just on that theme of some of Harrison that's relevant today, in 1917, when he founds the Liberty League, right up here in Harlem, East St. Louis, there's a racial pogrom on the East St. Louis African-American community in late June, early July of 1917. Black community killed. The number of dead ranged from 37 to 240. People are driven out of the town, out of the city. What's interesting is East St. Louis is 12 miles from Ferguson, right? Which we know today. Harrison calls a rally in New York. Over 1,000 people turn out to protest there, and he's preaching armed self-defense. I think 1917, and then of course we had demonstrations here in New York over Ferguson recently. But people, as far as I know, not too many people are familiar with this history, which is relevant. I think they could build on it. Black Lives Matter, and here's some of what from the New York Times account. Harrison said, this is over East St. Louis, time had come for Negroes to do what white men who were threatened to do, look out for themselves and kill rather than submit to being killed. We intend to fight if we must, an arm for our own self-defense, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, demand justice and make our voices heard. This is from his oratory that day. Here's East St. Louis. Here's one picture. This just happens, it's of interest to me because what you have is a streetcar, and there's a black man in front of the car. You might not be able to see this very clearly, but he's being attacked by a white mob while the National Guard stand around and do nothing, right? That was the climate back then. So Harrison, again, I want to drive these points home. This is very important because this is a central teaching subject of 20th century black history, the New Negro, right? Harrison is the founder of the first organization of the military. They call themselves the New Negro Movement, but it's based in social and political activism, but it's also extraordinarily literary because every paper that Harrison edits has poetry for the people and book review sections, and he's a brilliant writer. So he founds the Voice. He founds the first organization, first paper. He edits the New Negro, a monthly magazine. He writes When Africa Wakes. There's the subtitle, Inside Story of the Stirrings and Striving. And it's not until 1925 that Locke comes out with his New Negro, 1924-25 period, and that's what people mostly associate with it, a literary arts-based movement, but it's much more than that. Right? Here's a sample of Harrison's New Negro publication in 1919. Look at the topics: the women of our race, education in West Africa, the white war and the colored races, two Negro radicalisms. Harrison profoundly influenced a generation of New Negro militants and common people. He uses the phrase common people with affection because he's one of them, right? I argue in all my books on him, amongst his generation, he's the most class conscious of the race radicals and the most race conscious of the class radicals. He was the major radical influence on A. Philip Randolph, who's associated with his class radicalism in and around the Socialist Party and the labor movement. He is the major radical influence on Marcus Garvey, who's associated as being a race radical. We take those lines of descent down, it's Martin and Malcolm, because it's Martin who marches with Randolph at his side in the March on Washington movement, and Malcolm's father was a Garveyite preacher, and his mother was a reporter for the same Negro World paper that Harrison had been principal editor of. So I argue that Hubert Harrison is a key ideological link in the two great wings of the civil rights black liberation struggle. As a radical internationalist, again, that's what he called himself, he's extremely knowledgeable on Africa, Asia, Mideast, Americas, and Europe. Richard B. Moore, who I showed you a picture of, mentioned, says Harrison was above all the militant black socialists in his steady emphasis on the liberation of the oppressed African and colonial peoples. Historian Winston James has written a wonderful book, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, about early 20th century Caribbean radicalism, writes, Harrison had confidence in and humility before the peoples and cultures of Africa. His knowledge on this was encyclopedic. He proudly identified with the African continuities in St. Croix, where he's from. And for Harrison, and this is very important, Africa was primarily a teacher, not a primitive, unschooled child in need of civilization. And for those who are very much in, that's a reference to the founding objectives of the UNIA, that last statement, what James is writing. As a radical internationalist, Hubert Harrison wrote the following, though. He's a radical internationalist. Although I'm not satisfied with American conditions as they are now, I realize that in these days of change and unrest, I would not have been satisfied anywhere else. In China, I'd be fighting against foreign domination. Egypt, India, South Africa, or West Africa, I'd be fighting against the British oligarchs. In Jamaica, against the repression of black people practices by both whites and mulattoes. In Dutch, French, or American West Indies, against crackerism, stupidity, or cowardice. This is Hodge Kiernan from Montserrat. Kiernan worked not far from here on 13th Street in the Stiglitz Gallery. It was one of the leading avant-garde galleries in that period. And all the, a lot of the, it was a place where a lot of intellectuals would come, people interested in the arts. And probably the most brilliant guy in the whole building was Kiernan, who's the elevator operator, right? And he edited a publication called The Promoter in this period. But he wrote for both Harrison's papers and Garvey's papers. And he emphasized Hubert Harrison lived with and amongst his people, not on the fringes of their social life. And he says of Harrison's newspaper, The Voice, it crystallized the radicalism of the Negro in New York, exerted a tremendous influence in inspiring the people with the highest racial ideals and aspirations, inculcated into every Negro a sense of race pride and determination without parallel in the history of the race. This is what Kiernan's saying. And on Harrison in particular, he writes, and Harrison lived, and I'll show you a picture where he lived in a second. He lived at 231 West 134th Street for most of his time in Harlem, most densely populated block in Harlem, right? So he's, again, of the people. And Harrison lived with and amongst the people, not on the fringes of their social life, and he taught the masses and drew much of his inspiration from them. When he would walk down the street, his children would tell me about this, the kids, all the neighborhood kids, everybody knew him, right? He was very popular and well-liked and loved in the community. Harrison was the first Negro whose radicalism was comprehensive enough to include racialism, politics, theological criticism, sociology. So that's the praise he receives from Kiernan. So in general now, summing up, Harrison's approach, he's race conscious, he's class conscious, he's scientific, he's internationalist, he emphasizes the common people. He's a master of the mass approach. In his day, he's the leading soapbox orator, and he's the leading journalist. That's the two ways you reach the masses back then. This is pre-TV and pre-radio and pre-internet, right? He's a big proponent of direct action, proactive movement. He doesn't just sit around and wait. One of the big questions where he differs from Du Bois and others, from the NAACP, for instance, is he says the NAACP has no answer. What are you going to do if the white minds you're trying to reach don't respond in the way you want them? And he's not going to sit around. He's got to take some action with others, of course. He's anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. He's scientific. And in everything he does, and his children said, please always emphasize this, he challenged white supremacy. He understood it was central to capitalist rule in the U.S. This is Arthur Schomburg. Schomburg and Harrison are involved in things from the first decade. Harrison's in New York. Schomburg delivers the eulogy at Harrison's Harlem funeral. When Harrison dies in 1927 unexpectedly from appendicitis-related condition in December, thousands attend his funeral. Again, I said he was really well-liked. Schomburg delivers the eulogy, and he says Hubert Harrison was ahead of his time. In 1997, when the new edition of Harrison's When Africa Wakes was printed, the introduction was offered by John Henry Clark. And he writes similarly. This is, 70 years after what Schomburg said, but he goes, strong and clear voice of Hubert Harrison is speaking to us again. I hope this time we will listen. Let us try to complete the important theoretical work that he started, and that can be echoed again today. I mean, this is the sentiment. You know, we've much to learn from Harrison. Here's Harrison's unmarked shared grave in the Bronx. He died in poverty, right? And I'll get into why that was. In 1927, and from 1927 to 2014 December, this is where he was buried. He's still buried there, shared unmarked grave. But finally, there was some push. Some people here in the audience helped, call attention to this, and we have a gravesite marker now in Harrison's gravesite in Woodlawn Cemetery. You might want to go up there and take a look if you're in the area sometime. Now I'm going to talk a little about his Crucian roots and then get into his early years in New York and his political development. He's born in St. Croix. It's capitalist agriculture and slavery. It's a colony of Denmark. It has rich African customs, which he's familiar with, right? The color line and social control are different than what we have in the U.S. I'm going to get into that in a second. It's a rich history of direct action, mass struggle, and his family life. His father had been born enslaved in St. Croix. His mom was an immigrant from Barbados, a Bayesian immigrant, right? So he also had the experience of the immigrant experience too, which also broadens his perspective in many ways, right? I was able to track down the family that owned the estate where he was born. Here's photos from 1869. This is some of the earliest photographs out of St. Croix. This is the estate where he was born. What's very interesting, and I mentioned this earlier, there's a movement underfoot now because of the growing interest in Harrison to have the estate Concordia, where he was born, made a National Historic Park. And the people down there believe if this is done, it'll be the first National Historic Park in U.S., possessions or U.S., right? Named after an African-American. Historic park, not, historic site. Right? And so this is the sugar plantation he was born on. Harrison writes on the black people of the Virgin Islands. He's very familiar with their history. And he writes, the black people of the Virgin Islands are almost entirely of African extraction. Social characteristics are only adequately understood and appreciated by similar reference to characteristics we found in West African Negroes from among whom the slaves of Danish islands were mainly drawn, locale extending from upper Gold Coast to southern eastern limits of Nigeria. He also writes on the African communal traditions that are carried on as when he's growing up and what he knows. And amongst those, rooted in the African communal system, free public gardens on every plantation, agricultural laborers had their own land, provisional lands, surplus being disposed of in weekly markets. He talks about how these things were carried from Africa and continued in St. Croix. In terms of the rich history of direct action, in St. Croix, it was second after Haitian Revolution, in which there was an in the Americas, I believe, an enslaved-led emancipation victory. One of the leaders was a fellow named Budo in 1848. They called Budo. In 1878, the women of the island played a major role in what was called the Great Fire Burn, and it was followed by a general strike in 1879. It was over labor conditions on the island. Queen Mary Thomas was one of the leaders of that 1878 struggle. If you go to St. Croix today, the main east-west road on the island is named Queen Mary Highway. One of Harrison's good friends, D. Hamilton Jackson's a national hero down there. He's a friend, and he was a labor leader in St. Croix, and they maintained communication all the way through until Harrison's death. Jackson came and visited Harrison in New York. Harrison was never able to go back to St. Croix. This is the village Harrison. He's born in 1883, so this is 14 years before he was born. That's what it looked like when I went back. I've been back several times, but I took photos in, 2008. And if you look, it's the same buildings. They just put a little facade on some of the structures, but it's basically, not far different from when he grew up. What's very interesting, the plantation he was owned by two men of color. Now, you wouldn't find that for the most part down south. And this is where I'm going to get into some of the differences between St. Croix and the U.S. Basically, in St. Croix, and this is the other work I write on, besides all the Harrison work, the other work I do is, again, Theodore W. Allen, who's the author of The Invention of the White Race, and he talks about racial oppression and social control. But in St. Croix, for social control reasons, there was a policy of promotion, not strict proscription, for a sector of the African-descended population. There was no formal segregation in St. Croix, no history of lynch terror, and white supremacy was not as virulent, or this is in a period when Harrison's growing up, or as organized as in the U.S. And part of the reason is St. Croix, 80% of the population was black, only 5% European, 15% were colored, quote, colored. So the ruling elite, in order to maintain social control, had to try and use the 15%. And it worked for a while until push came to shove, and then the free colored side with the black plantation laborers. That's why you have that early emancipation in St. Croix. And, but some of the contrast is what I want to point to. During slavery in St. Croix, free colored served in the militia. Under still slavery in 1834, they were extended an edict of full equality, which at least nominally granted them full rights in terms of the law, and they were extended some landholding opportunities. In contrast, in the U.S., slave patrols, which is how they maintained control, were lily white, no free coloreds and no slave patrols. Black people had no rights that a white was bound to respect, as codified in the Dred Scott decision, and the general policy was severe racial proscription for all African Americans. When Harrison came from St. Croix, he commented on the difference. When Marcus Garvey comes, when Claude McKay from Jamaica, they comment on the difference. Claude McKay articulates it very well. Here's what McKay writes. He writes, when he came to the U.S., he explained that when he came to the U.S., it was the first time I had ever come face to face with such manifest, implacable hatred of my race, and my feelings were indescribable. This is a little bit, and Harrison had a very similar reaction. Now, a little more on Harrison. He's born on the plantation. He moves to Christiansted, which is the capital city. I was up at a Columbia talk in between some of the talks today, and one woman was talking about one-room schoolhouses and conditions, but the water gut is a gutter, right? So this is where Harrison lived when he's there. He's living in the poorest sections. He's living with his mom in the poorest sections. This is not Harrison's family, but this is the housing in the area where he lived. He arrives in New York in 1900. It was after the city's fourth grade, what they billed as a race riot. It was said a black man could not walk between 23rd Street and 42nd Street without fear of being attacked by a mob. This is before the IRT subway was built, so the main African-American, Afro-Caribbean community was around what's called the San Juan Hill area. When Harrison first comes to the U.S., he's living on West 62nd Street, right? And that's in 1900. West 63rd Street, Thelonious Monk, 20 years later. That's where he grows up, right? After the IRT is built in 1904, Harrison moves up to Harlem. But so when he comes to New York, this is what he encounters. He can't believe what he's encountering. Here's the tenements that he lived in. This is actually the ones on 63rd Street. The one on Harrison lived in 62nd Street is no longer there, but they were described as the meanest tenements in New York. But this 63rd Street one, which was built in 2006, was a new modern tenement, right? And what was the improved conditions? If you had the inside rooms, you had a courtyard, you got some air, right? This is the main innovation. Same year that Harrison arrives, this is 4 men at one time down in Georgia, as I recall. At least 107 African Americans were lynched that year. Again, no lynching down there. He is shocked by lynching. And that prompts him to write to the New York Times. That's when he starts writing to the New York Times. And one reason he starts writing these letters in the Times is he's of the belief, he knows what white supremacy is, he knows what discrimination is, but he goes, sometimes when the Negro enters fully into the intellectual life of the white American, the customary barriers based on the assumption of his inferiority tend to break down. You might get judged by your product, right, by what you write. Now, what Harrison does with some of the other leading working-class black intellectuals in New York is they have lyceums where they meet and they have great intellectual community. It's a model we could learn from today. Two of the principal places they met are on 53rd Street. One church is still there, St. Benedict the Moor Church on West 53rd, and a block away was St. Mark's AME. And they'd hold lyceums. Once a week they would come and they'd have their sessions. Involved in those lyceums were people like Schomburg. Now, Schomburg, people know the name, but he was a clerk, right? John E. Bruce, one of the leading journalists of the era, is a messenger, right? St. Benedict's Lyceum, listen to what Harrison says about it. He goes, it was the germ of black racial consciousness in New York. For one thing, it was a place where African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans would come together because there was some tension, immigrant group coming in, and there was some tension. But here they would come together. And he says the fiercest opposition and debate could not take from the cordiality of personal friendship. We learned to insist on the right to differ, to criticize and dissent that which we believe to be wrong, and do this openly and publicly without beating the devil around the stump. This is the type of intellectual atmosphere I think we would probably agree we need today, right? We got a lot of problems we got to deal with. All right, here's George Young, another one he's active in one of the lyceums. He's a Pullman porter. Again, these are black working class intellectuals. He has a stall on 135th Street, besides when he's not doing his Pullman porter, 12,000 books on black history selling out of a stall on 135th Street. Here's Charles Burroughs, works with Harrison in the post office. Harrison gets hired in the post office. In Harrison's diary, I'm a postal worker for 32 years, right? So I can appreciate some of this stuff. Harrison would come back, we called it the night shift. They get back at 3 in the morning, and then they would have study groups. And they would correspond with people in the Caribbean and Cuba, places like this. And they're dealing with all these issues, until daybreak. And Charles Burroughs was one of them, but he's also a leading black actor. He founded the Kriegel Players, which were in 1925, 26, I believe, in the basement of the 135th Street Public Library. And his son is the co-founder of the DuSable Museum in Chicago, which is the leading African-American museum in the country. His wife is the woman I showed you before, Williana Jones Burroughs, teacher, a unionist, political candidate. When she was the host in the Soviet Union was our ally during World War II. She was doing English language broadcast. She also goes to a big conference in the late 20s, International Conference of Negro Trade Unionists, where they get black workers from around the world, a small cadre of very, very good and articulate workers who come together to try and start addressing some of these problems people are facing. For the woman who asked about people to write about, here is a 19th century intellectual woman that you might want to, she's in the center of that picture, and the woman, this is Frances, her name is Frances Reynolds Kaiser. First black woman to graduate from Hunter College. She's a major figure in the Negro Women's Club movement. It's the Empire State Federation of Negro Women, I think was the organizational title. She's on the executive board, founding member of the NAACP, but she's running a White Rose Home, which she takes over from Victoria Earl Matthews, who's another outstanding 19th century black woman journalist and stuff. And this White Rose Home that they have is a place where black women from down south, from the Caribbean, from Africa, when they come to New York, they would have a place where they could live, with some security and safety. And also if they had children, they had classes, they had kind of daycare for the kids. And Harrison, he's very much into community service. He would go teach for free. And he lived in poverty. He'd teach for free classes for the kids and teach Negro history to the women, in one night a week. Here, he starts a diary, Africana Studies. This is his pledge in his diary. Pledge to the mother race from an untamed, untamable African. Poor, heart-sore, and soul-starved mother race, who shall minister to thy deep desires? Who shall bind up thy wounds? O Africa, when shall be the term of thy long degradation? Behold, here even now I pledge thee, O my mother, that I shall devote my years to thee. Take my youth, my labors, my love, my life, my all, and do thou, when I shall have died for thee, take me to thy bosom, an untamed, untamable African. That's a dedication that he, at age 24, and that's how he dedicates his life in his diary. And Harrison describes himself as an intellectual in full touch with the life of my people. So in 1908, I believe this is from, he's writing, and he talks about his plans to try and write a history of the American Negro. But he goes, I want to get deeper into what's really going on, into the psyche, into understanding. So he goes, it will bring a knowledge of psychology and sociology. It will be not just simply, it'll be a storehouse of information, but not an encyclopedia. It will attempt to bring the history of the race, something of the philosopher's insight, perception of laws. All this my history must be, thus my haunting of the YWCA, the YMCA, the White Rose Home, disreputable club, Streets of Evil, and Sordid Association, my social work, my attendance at revival meetings, all of this to put me in full touch with my people so I can better write their history. Rather unique intellectual. He breaks from religion in this period, particularly Christianity is what he's breaking from. I divorced myself from Orthodox, and he goes back, and when he does it, he goes back through the history, again, which I think some of the people here work on, right? The history of Christianity, and he kind of pulls it apart, some of the superior historical criticism. And he divorces himself from Orthodox and institutional Christianity. What had gone was the authenticity of the Bible. And he says, I turned to a new belief, agnosticism. I said belief, what I meant was a philosophy of life. He refused to put faith in that which does not rest on sufficient evidence. Now, the term agnosticism or agnostic was coined by Thomas Huxley, and it's not a creed but a method. It's basically the scientific method. Harrison is going to turn to science to address social problems, right? That's where the direction he wants to move. So he's of the free thought inclination, And free thought was very popular among some circles in this period, the first decade, second decade of the 20th century. Free of religious dogma, it emphasized the human origin of the Old and New Testament, denied the infallibility of the Bible, emphasized reason, emphasized scientific method. There is a host of leading activists, male and female activists people would be familiar with. There's a list up there. I'm not going to read all the names, free thinkers, but all of this is in my book. But there's also a very interesting list of black activists who are free thinkers, and most people don't associate with this. And there are some of them: Richard B. Moore, Cyril Briggs, Randolph, McKay, Rogers, Cannon, who I showed you a picture, and Du Bois, although it's not emphasized, but this is not from his biography, the Pulitzer Prize-winning 2-volume biography, but Lewis points out elsewhere that, according to David Levering Lewis, Du Bois was an agnostic and an anti-clerical. That's one of the articles he did. Harrison's wife, Irene Louise Horton Harrison, her family comes, we believe, we think we've tracked it down pretty well, from Demerara, which is a region, present-day Guyana, up to Antigua, Puerto Rico, up here, and they marry in 1909, I believe. Here's the house where Harrison lived, 231 West 134th Street. When I took this photo, it was early 1990s. This was when period when a lot of, crap in the area. It looks very different now. But this is where they lived, and Harrison starts developing. He starts out, and he's kind of a Du Bois follower, in the debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. But he starts to develop some early criticisms of the NAACP. One of the things that happens is the founding meetings that lead to the formation of the NAACP are in New York City, Charities Hall, I think it was late 1909, early 1910. And at those meetings, when there are some reports that come out after the meetings, one of the things that happens is some of the critical comments by black participants were elided from the published transcript, taken out of the published transcript. He goes, that's no way to start this organization. You can't have this organization shaping it to white people's expectations of how black people should act. So that's one of his early criticisms, is that the NAACP was limited by white people's views, right? Du Bois is the editor of the Crisis. But although Harrison started out as a Du Bois follower, he had some differences with Du Bois. And I'm going to point some early ones now, but towards the end, I'm going to show you more deeper ones, right? One of the differences Harrison had with Du Bois was over the talented tenth. This is a concept Du Bois is very much associated with. And he described it as the educated and gifted who must be made leaders of thought and missionaries of culture among their people. Harrison argued that the talented tenth hadn't provided the leadership needed. They should come down from their Mount Sinai's, and he didn't think that the colored leadership and their statistics on who this leadership was were preordained to lead. He didn't think a touch of white blood preordained anybody to be a leader of the black race, right? He didn't get mean-spirited about it, but he called it. He's also very critical of Booker T. Washington. And Harrison kept scrapbooks, and we've got the scrapbooks up at Columbia. Fascinating, because today we keep things with digital files, right? We have digital files, but back then he kept scrapbooks, and he'd paste them, and he had all these on all different topics. And he had one called Subservience, and the most prominent person in that one was Booker T. Washington. That's how he classified Booker T. And one of the quotes I use in the book, Washington said of President Theodore Roosevelt, "I will oppose nothing that he wants done and will help forward all that he wants to have done." So Harrison, that seemed to classify as a subservient, right? And what happens in 1910, Booker T goes to London and to Copenhagen, and he issues some statements basically saying black people are faring fairly well back home. Now, this is a period of lynching, segregation, disfranchisement. Du Bois gets together a petition with about 50 prominent people, writes some protest. Harrison's working in the post office, and he writes 2 letters to the New York Sun, one of the daily newspapers in New York, basically saying, Booker T, you're free to say what you want, but you should tell the truth, right? And Booker T had a Tuskegee machine. He didn't play, right? And so this is Booker T and Emmett Scott, his assistant, and they had Harrison summarily fired from the post office. Again, I said I worked 32 years in the post office. I was a union steward. I knew how to dig and research, and I got Harrison's postal record. He had a clean postal record. We worked right down the block, 34th Street post office, right? And he's summarily fired, for writing 2 letters to the paper critical of Booker T. And one more thing, since we're in New York, the postmaster who Booker T's people reached, who fired Harrison, named Morgan, and Morgan is the name of the post station in New York, the biggest post station in New York on 38th and 39th Street. Morgan Station, named after the guy who fired Harrison. Harrison joins the Socialist Party. When Harrison joins the Socialist Party, at least their platform had much appeal. If you look at it, and it was a period of growth for the socialists. But nationalization of industries, 8-hour workday, graduated income tax, women's suffrage, public works programs, a lot of things people could probably get behind today, right? He writes the first major series on the Negro and socialism in the Call, the paper of the Socialist Party. He starts developing arguments that racial oppression is socio-historical, not biological. He proposes a new litmus test for socialists to champion the cause of the Negro as a central principal duty. He argues all should oppose race prejudice, and he initiates a colored socialist club, the first ever by the socialists. The socialists already had women's clubs and foreign language federation. He said, well, let's do something, you know, and reach out to black workers, black people, right? Colored socialist club. Party was split oftentimes by two factions, and we have manifestations of this today, the political evolutionary socialists and the industrial revolutionary socialists. The evolutionary socialists said, let's change the laws and get people elected. The revolutionary socialists, let's take more militant action. Harrison argued to both. He says, look, the duty of the party is to champion the cause of the Negro. If you want political action, you need black votes. To the industrial ones who want militant action amongst workers, you need black workers. You know, so he's trying to, with their own logic, appeal to them. And he thought that this question was crucial for those who really wanted socialism, to address white supremacy. Harrison also challenges, and I was at a thing at Columbia today, so I find this very interesting, but he challenges, and I think these points are crucial, two main ideological props of white supremacy amongst European American workers. One, the idea that racism is innate, because if racism is innate, why fight it? You can't change it. The second argument is that European American workers benefit from this system of white supremacy. Harrison was clear. The ruling whites certainly benefit, but he says this is not in the interest of working class people. We know the privileges exist. We understand that, right? But it's like a poison bait is the core argument that's being offered. If you're a worker and you've been out in strikes or struggles, you know you stand with your workers, your co-workers, that's it. Or if you're down south during the sit-ins, you stand with your workers. If somebody comes and offers you $5, you don't break ranks, right? You know, so it's that perspective that Harrison's coming from. If you don't get anything else out of Harrison's political perspective, perhaps you can remember this one because I think it's so important. This is what he writes in 1911. Politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. A touchstone is a black stone. You rub it against the metal to see if it's really the gold it's purported to be. It's a wonderful metaphor. Any issue we look at in society, housing, education, employment, life expectancy, health, let's put it to the test. How are black people fare and what are we going to do about it? It's a guide to action. He goes on in that same paragraph to essentially say that true democracy and equality for the Negro implies a revolution startling to even think of. And what that statement does, I believe, is foreshadows the 1960s, when the civil rights black liberation movement is a catalyst for all these other movements for progressive social change. The anti-war movement, student movement, women's movement, gay and lesbian rights. Everything takes sustenance from that civil rights black liberation struggle. And why? Because the struggle was just, and because it hits so directly at how the ruling class maintains control in this country. He offers other comments on democracy. He's clear. As long as the color line exists, the cant. A cant is an insincere, repetitive chant. The cant of democracy is dust in the eyes of white voters. This dust in the eyes, I think, is very crucial. It's like a white blind spot concept. And during World War I, the idea of democracy was widely advertised mainly as convenient camouflage behind which competing imperialists masked their sordid aims. So what I argue is Harrison, as a thinker, understood the twofold character of democracy in America. By twofold character, what do I mean? I mean this. If a, quote, democracy is a lily-white democracy, a lily-white trade union, a gerrymandered lily-white congressional district, it's a reactionary, it's a retardant to progressive social change. But if it's thoroughgoing and genuine democracy hitting at white supremacy, it's a catalyst for social change. I think Harrison makes that argument. So Harrison's in the Socialist Party in 1912, and he's writing in a major journal of the Socialists, and he writes Southernism or Socialism. He lays it out in the main pages of the party journal, what's going to be the future direction of this party. This before the 1912 convention. They don't even address what he's raising, but they do take positions. They don't address the Negro question at all, but they do address Asian immigration. In the debate on Asian immigration, the Socialist Party of America takes some of the most racist positions in the history of that organization. And here's what they write at the core. Race feeling is not so much a result of social as biological evolution. It is deeper than any class feeling. Class consciousness must be learned, but race consciousness is inborn and cannot be wholly unlearned. This is the racism is innate concept that Harrison said was at the core of so much white supremacist belief, right? He also argues that 10 million Negroes of America form a group that is more essentially proletarian, and under slavery, they were the most thoroughly exploited of the American proletariat. I'm not going to go into great detail now, but this is a crucial concept. He understands black labor as proletarian. He understands slavery as capitalism, slaveholders as capitalists, and the laborers as proletarians. We see the same thing in Du Bois in 1935 in Black Reconstruction, a book which reshapes our understanding of U.S. history. And he says, yet the labor movement, with few exceptions, never had the intelligence or knowledge to see in black slavery and Reconstruction the kernel and the meaning of the labor movement. Because if we understand black labor as proletarian, first we learn some of the most valiant struggles and activists in the history of the labor movement, number one. Two, we tear the cover off white labor's betrayal of black labor, because there were all these well, they're not really laborers, we're the labor movement, all that. And what Allen argues, the other fellow in the books I'm working on, when we don't understand enslaved black labor as proletarian, as labor, we are hindered in understanding the function and origin of the white race. Harrison is active with the IWW, which was a left-wing movement in the labor movement in various parts of the country, including Paterson, New Jersey, up in New England, out west. And they believed in direct action, pretty militant program. Here's Harrison. He's the only black speaker. This is Paterson, New Jersey, the major labor struggle in 1913. He's with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Big Bill Haywood, and according to the Paterson papers, he gave the most militant talks of all the orators. The place where he's seated is now the American Labor Museum, and they do periodic programs, including Harrison. Harrison leaves the Socialist Party. When he leaves the Socialist Party, here's what he says. I think this is profound also. I think this is also profound. I think it's probably the most profound but least heated criticism in the history of the U.S. left. He stated simply that the Socialist Party, like the labor movement, has insisted on the white race first and class after. It put the white race first before class. Brings us directly into the, what is this white race thing? How do they deal with it? Right. So he then goes independent for a while, radical. Got another 10 minutes. We'll wrap this up. Radical forum, free thought, free speech. Starts talking about the racial aspects of the war. Teaches at a place called the Modern School. Again, a lot of the leading activists, leading currents of that day. And Harrison's there teaching courses on modern religion, things like this, ancient religions. At the Modern School, socialism, syndicalism, revolution, free love, birth control, all these thoughts were being taught. Harrison in this period writes a stunning critique of Christianity, on Christianity and conservatism. America created the color line. He goes through this. This is all in that Harrison reader I have. We'll have copies out there if anybody wants them. He writes extraordinary pieces on the economic motives behind war. This is the period of World War I. Lenin starts writing on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. What Harrison's writing here compares very favorably in terms of the economic analysis with Lenin. He makes two significant predictions regarding the war, because it's a war being fought in the name of democracy, in which the leading powers that are fighting, it's over control of the peoples of the world, right? So he says, on the international level, the European conflict for colonial possessions would awaken racial and national consciousness. This is out, in the colonies and throughout the world. And domestically in the U.S., it will result in a sweeping tide of racial consciousness. James Weldon Johnson, people familiar with. James Weldon Johnson and the librarian at the 135th Street Library at the time, Ms. Cohn, they encourage Harrison to start bringing all his talks to Harlem, because he's still, he's left the socialist, he's now more in Midtown and stuff. They say, bring it up here. An open air, Johnson writes an open air lecture course in the leading black weekly in New York at the time, New York Age. He says, Harrison, it would be like a university extension carried to the farthest. And Harrison would give a series of lectures that would be more than equivalent to a year of college and of incalculable benefit to the community. Harrison does turn to doing concentrated work in the black community, but one last stage before he gets there is he starts doing some theater reviews. And in it, he analyzes the role of black artists, black actors, black audience. And it's the same issue people are dealing with today in terms of black images in the, on TV and the movies and things like this. And he uses this to get to probe more deeply. And it's his final stage before he founds the New Negro movement. In his period, Harrison's being followed by A. Philip Randolph. Randolph's buddy is Chandler Owen. They're following him. Harrison starts articulating his belief that the unity we need has got to come from the bottom up. That's qualitatively different than Booker T with his political machine and Du Bois' talented pen. 5 more minutes. That's okay. He starts delivering lectures, Birth of the New Negro Movement, Race Conscious, Internationalist. It's a proactive policy not dependent on whites. It opposes white supremacy. Here's Richard B. Moores following Harrison. Here's the leaflet from the first meeting of Harrison's Liberty League, June 12, 1917, Bethel AME Church on 132nd Street. Look at the slogan. Woodrow Wilson had just led the U.S. into war, make the world safe for democracy. Harrison says, let's make the South safe for democracy. Right? Let's bring it. And the speakers listed down below, Hubert Harrison, Chandler Owen, Clayton Powell, and at this rally, Harrison invites Marcus Garvey up for his first major presentation before a Harlem crowd. The Liberty League opposes lynching, segregation, disfranchisement. It calls for enforcement 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, federal anti-lynching legislation, a political voice. Harrison's paper is the voice, militant armed self-defense. Enforcement 13th, 14th, this is the early civil rights movement. But the whole history of that civil rights movement, I've got side stories I can tell you and all this. It's very important to understand demanding federal anti-lynching legislation. Why? Because if there's federal anti-lynching legislation, you have some chance of justice. You don't get like the Emmett Till case where the culprits walk in, and just joke around. But what's interesting for people to know is the NAACP in this period did not advocate federal anti-lynching legislation. And the NAACP did not have black national leadership for its first 10 decades, right? And they did not advocate because they didn't want to alienate Southern white support. This is all very well documented in the books, and not only by me, but by specialists in the field. Harrison's preaching armed self-defense. He's demanding a political voice. His paper's the voice. He emphasizes the international duty of the Liberty League, his organization, responsibility to 1,700 millions who are colored, black, brown, and yellow, and special sympathy for the 250 millions of our brethren in Africa. Here's their flag that I mentioned, the tricolor flag, black, brown, and yellow. And he says the reason they do that, he says we chose black, brown, and yellow because that's the colors we are domestically and internationally. Garvey joins Harrison's organization. People familiar with Marcus Garvey? He's not one to join anyone else's organization. He joins Harrison's Liberty League. From the Liberty League, The Voice, Liberty League had his paper, The Voice, had a circulation of 11,000, which was pretty big in Harlem at that period, an estimated readership of 55,000. Harrison claimed from the Liberty League Garvey appropriated every feature that was worthwhile in his movement. Secret of Garvey's success was he held to the Negro masses those things which bloomed in hearts, racialism, race consciousness, racial solidarity, things taught first in 1917 by the Voice and the Liberty League. If people are familiar with Garvey, he comes to the U.S., he's a follower of Booker T, right? And he's prepared to go back, but then he sees Harrison on a street corner and gets invited up. And then he starts holding joint meetings. They're meeting in Lafayette Hall uptown, and Harrison meet, and then Garvey. And my advisor, one of my advisors when I was writing my dissertation, Hollis Lynch, has written, on some of this period, knows it pretty well. My other advisor, Nathan Huggins, very good historians. And Lynch says, Jeff, it's important to emphasize to your audience, when Harrison's holding his meetings, in Lafayette Hall, and Garvey comes 2 hours later, a lot of the people go into both, right? There's a lot of movement back and forth. Harrison's influence on Garvey. This is from Anselmo Jackson. Anselmo Jackson was another person who wrote for Garvey's paper and for Harrison's paper. He goes, beginning in 1916, Harrison was preaching an advanced type of radicalism. Followers of Harrison responding to his demand, new Negro movement among Negroes be organized, formed the Liberty League, etc. Garvey publicly eulogized Harrison, joined the Liberty League, and took a keen interest in his fears. Harrison was the forerunner of Garvey, contributed largely to his success. This is Anselmo Jackson in later life. I don't know, I can't see everyone in the audience right now, but his grandson, who was going to try and come today, sent me this picture, and this is in later life, Anselmo Jackson. Harrison's influence on Garvey, it's not just Anselmo Jackson. W.A. Domingo, Garvey's boyhood friend, first editor of Negro World, writes, Garvey came at psychological moment. However, before him there was Hubert Harrison, brilliant man, great intellectual. Garvey, like the rest of us, followed Hubert Harrison. William Ferris, next editor, principal editor of the Negro World. Garvey rapidly crystallized Harrison's ideas. J.A. Rogers, who I quoted before, said one of the men who was much influenced by Harrison was Garvey. Garvey movement was fructified in spirit. So he's a major influence in all these. Here's Domingo. Andy Razaf, poet, writes a lot of poetry, leading poet in that period for Harrison's paper. Last 2 minutes. Liberty League, 1918. U.S. is at World War I. And Harrison and William Monroe Trotter from Boston decided to convene a Liberty Congress to put forth demands, black protest demands during World War I. It is the major black protest effort in World War I. Men and women from 35 states come to Washington, D.C. to meet and put forth their demands in their program. And now what's happening? Here we go. Jolie Spingarn is the head of the NAACP in this time. Spingarn is pro-war. He's the chairman of the NAACP. Joel Spingarn is also a major in military intelligence. This is him in his military uniform. Hear what I'm saying? This is like COINTELPRO later on, right? This is the head of the NAACP. He is also, by W.E.B. Du Bois's own admission, Du Bois's closest white friend, right? Spingarn, the first big issue comes up in World War I was the officers' training camps. You know, the black press was beating hard on the drums. We want integrated officers' training camps. You're calling for people to go fight for what we want, the camps integrated. According to Charles Flynn Kellogg, historian of the NAACP, they were on the verge of winning that demand when Spingarn speaks up on behalf of the black community and says, we will, accept the segregated camps. Now, Spingarn, again, is European American. He's not, African American. And so Spingarn does more. He talks to Du Bois. Du Bois is Spingarn's closest white friend, and he gets Du Bois to start following his lead on this issue. I mean, Du Bois makes his own decision. But, and what they do is they hold a colored editors conference, colored, right, that phrase, to meet a week before the Liberty Congress of Harrison and Trotter, and to try and steal the thunder. But whereas Harrison and Trotter's organization, men and women from 35 states, it's an all-male affair, what Spingarn and Du Bois convened. And amongst people they had, it wasn't an all-black affair either, because they had FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was one of the people who spoke. Now, FDR in this period, people may not be familiar with this, but he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, I believe, for a while, and he was claiming credit for being so personally responsible for writing much of the occupation constitution of Haiti, in this period when the U.S. goes down and occupies Haiti. So what happens is Du Bois and Spingarn get together, they hold the Liberty Congress, and then Du Bois makes a decision to put in an application for a captaincy in military intelligence. You hear what I'm saying? This is Du Bois. Booker T had died, people were looking to Du Bois, and Du Bois puts in an application for a captaincy in military intelligence. And in order to seal the deal, the quid pro quo, if you will, Du Bois writes an editorial in July 1918, Crisis Magazine, which he's the editor of, called Close Ranks. It's only one paragraph long. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances. And he had defined special grievances 2 months earlier. Lynching, segregation, everybody knew what they were, right? This is what's going on then. And close ranks behind the war effort. Harrison tore him up, right? Now, basically Harrison says, look, we can differ on the war, but you don't have to take it there. And he writes, in Du Bois, he writes The Descent of Du Bois, Descent of Du Bois, and it's an article which not only criticizes that, but criticizes the application for the captaincy, exposes it, kind of, And years later, Herbert Aptheker, who collects a lot of Du Bois things and publishes them, writes later on with no footnote. He says Du Bois later came to acknowledge that the criticisms of his stance during World War I were correct. But Du Bois will never talk to Harrison again for the rest of his life. Right? So this is where I end first volume, 1918 Harrison. Harlem's considered the center of radical black thought. Harrison's the leading voice of Harlem radicalism. He's only 35. Led in challenging capitalism, white supremacy, leading black activist in the Socialist Party, founded a new Negro movement, major black protest in World War I, in wartime America. He had influenced a generation of activists and common people, laid out broad parameters that would shape and influence much black radical thought in the 20th century, left an important legacy for the 21st century. There we go. Hubert Harrison. Thank you. I saw you coming.
Now,
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, everyone.
I'll be here if people want to talk.
you can
We're talking.
speak with the maestro there, and he will answer all questions
Yeah,
that you have.
and,
Let us give him a standing ovation for this great presentation.
And Eric, as I mentioned, next time, if we can do this, I want to do volume 2, which people will be very interested. Harrison and Garvey, Harrison, New Negro Movement, Harrison in Africa. A lot of good things coming up. And the books, if anybody's interested in the books, we're not allowed to sell them here, but I'm stepping outside in a little bit. Everything's at cost.
We'll ask the musicians to move up. This is the final stage of our presentation today. We have to be out here in a half an hour. Unfortunately so. Come to Brooklyn tomorrow at the Commons, where we will continue this conversation and this discussion. Thank you very much, sisters and brothers, as we get ready for this musical presentation by Kerry Brown and Al Mosley.
Hey. Huh? I just got to, I'm going to delete the file. We go talk, all right? Great. Hey, this is who I'm mentioning. That was his grandfather in the picture. Yeah. Good. We're talking a little bit. Hello. Hi. The books, the biography is 20, the reader is 22, you know, so their cost. The Invention of White Race, 2 volumes for 30, it sells for 60. Everything's at cost, and I got little pamphlets for $3 each. The 4 books, 30, 50, 72, and 2 pamphlets, 60, 78. Invention of White Race, and on Harrison, by John Jackson. Good stuff. Let me just, I got to delete, give me 1 minute, let me get this. All right? I want to come up to Smith. You know, I've been talking to Mass Amherst about putting Harrison, some of these papers up there, too.
That would be fine. They should give that talk at UMass.
Yeah, well, I did at the, they used to have that bookstore there, you know, in Amherst, right? All Points of View, I think, or something like that. They had a bookstore. And Ernie Allen wrote the fact blurb for the one thing. Anybody familiar with Windows here? It's been a while. I just want to trash my thing. Yeah, I know. I don't see it. That's where it is on my computer. I'm looking for the recycle bin. Can you help me find the recycle bin?
This is you?
No, I already deleted. I just want to go to recycle bin. Gone forever. I'll show you these things if you want. And
Will you be there tomorrow?
no, I'm not going to be there tomorrow. I got to write. Actually, I'm meeting this guy who spoke at Columbia today.
Okay, buddy, anytime you want to hear.
You want to talk to him a little bit? Set the mood?